Hello.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? I'm gonna get started just because I'm super tired, so if I wait too long, I won't be very functional. You doing okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. How are you today?
Pretty good. Well, I know that trying to remember, I'm gonna say I know something, but I don't know. What is that? Okay. If we go to, oops, the next, we're gonna be on module 5. And I know we have an assignment due for the step part 2 on October 7th. So we're going to go over how to do the next phase of the policy analysis process. And
Okay.
and we'll just, it shouldn't take too long. It does take a little bit of research to do it, but it's not too difficult to understand the process. So it's pretty straightforward. So we have a couple of things that are are I think good ways of solving problems, and this is probably true at every phase of intervention mapping. And then it's really good. Of policy mapping. It's very good at program policy. Program planning. It's good for evaluation. It's good for a variety of things that need to be worked as groups. But in that case, what happens is you post questions of whatever it is we need to do. So what is it we're supposed to find out? You post those questions as a group. You brainstorm the potential answers to those questions and you write them all down. Um, and then either as a group or individually, or you kind of assign stuff to people. They go away and they take those potential answers and they're going to review, are these answers realistic? Do they really answer the question that, are they something we can actually use? And the way you do that, you either go to the empirical literature, so has somebody done it before? Or if really maybe you're working on a problem that people haven't addressed before, or a problem that hasn't been addressed well, that nobody's really found a solution to, then you wouldn't actually just do what other people have done and hasn't worked. But then you may turn to theory, to see if there is a theory that you can follow, that you can use as a framework to address a problem, maybe one that somebody hasn't tried to use before, and then you can go and review those theories to see if there's anything that you have, that maybe somebody else has missed that you might be able to use. And then once you have all that information, you can decide, okay, from these things, assess those. Do we need more information? Do we have a good, do we have a good list of answers that we can start with? So that's probably a process that you can use for really pretty much any kind of research process that you have to do in a group. And then this here are the tips for every step of policy analysis: is to start early, read the chapter that is assigned. I would use this what we call the IM core processes, which we just talked about, and then make sure that you keep all your references organized, because that's usually the ugly thing at the end, trying to figure out where you found something if somebody didn't keep track of it. So when we go to the policy analysis, assemble the evidence phase, we have key questions that we need to address in phase 2. So there are 3 key questions that that's kind of now what the group is going to be trying to answer. So first is, how can we further quantitate the problem that we have defined in step 1? So you have defined a problem in step 1. How can we strengthen that definition? How can we, so we say it's a problem. Do we need to frame this in a manner that convinces others that this is in fact a problem? So sometimes it's talking about how prevalent the problem is, or it could be how many people it affects, or it could be what the cost of the problem is. What kinds of things can you use to add weight to your statement that this is in fact a problem that needs addressing? So think about this part as being kind of persuasive for this question. So you need to make sure that when you frame your problem, that it is as persuasive, that people know that this is in fact a problem that needs addressing. So that's an important thing in policy, is to convince people that, in fact, what you're trying to fix is a problem. The other thing is to start identifying the promising solutions to the problem. So you also are going to be doing the research to try to say, okay, we said this is a problem. Well, how are different ways in which we could address this problem? And then the other thing you start doing at this phase is trying to understand the political and social environments in which you're going to be working, because that can either help you. So there may be some political and social environments that will make it easier or facilitate your solutions. And then there may be political and social environments that hinder the solutions. So it's really kind of, sometimes, you may come up with a solution that work very well, but the political environment or the social environment is such that it's not going to be possible to do it. So, for example, there are places where there is an opioid epidemic crisis. People are using heroin and they're injecting heroin. And because they're doing this, they're having sexually, they're basically getting infections like HIV, right? So normally sexually transmitted, can also be bloodborne. In some jurisdictions, they have been able to do needle exchange programs, but in others, the political environment is such that that is not an option. It's not an optional, or you either, and on, it's either not an option, or if that is your, as a group, you're convinced that's the right solution, then you also need to figure out how to convince or change the social and political environment so that you can convince people that that's the solution. Do you have any idea? I know we have Lanice and Basant on the call, but do you guys have any idea? Do you have any examples of where you may see that, where you may have a problem that the solution, although obvious, may be something that is not politically or socially palatable to the population or the society in which you're working?
Me and my group, we are talking about abuse for women who suffer from Alzheimer.
Okay.
So last week when we were researching, I found that women with this disease are exposed to abuse either from their relatives or from the places they are staying in.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So if they have the abuse from the family, I don't know if we can find something to solve this issue, because it's a lot of load on the family taking care of this person who is sick.
Uh-huh.
So socially, I don't think that there will be. I know that we can talk to them and we can offer to help, but at the end, they are the only ones who are gonna take care of this person.
Okay.
That person dies. So maybe socially, there won't be a solution for them.
Okay. Absolutely. And I think the next slide will give you some ideas of how to handle that, because the violence in itself is not the only problem. There's usually root causes to the violence. So, and that kind of brings us to maybe start thinking about identifying promising solutions to the problem, because sometimes it's not, you see a problem and you need to look for the root cause of the problem. So there's violence against the elderly. Why is there violence against the elderly? Because maybe if you identify those whys, you don't have to step in and stop the violence. You can stop what led up to the violence. So, so let's see, if we go to, this is a framework that is widely used in health education to, in program planning, in order to determine what are the possible solutions to a problem that we may be trying to address. And so it's one of those programs that sort of works backwards. So if you're taking program planning, if you've taken program planning, you've seen this model before. But we could say that so for example, Basant's violence towards the elderly and the family kind of it's a quality of life issue, correct? I mean, it's not something that any of us want to experience or see anybody experience, and it does have health, obviously, health effects. Violence towards the elderly, one is it can worsen the symptoms of Alzheimer's, but it can also lead to them being injured. Um, so we know that that kind of violence becomes an issue. Well, then you have to start thinking of why. If this is violence towards the elderly that is affecting this problem, what are some of the things that are behavioral or lifestyle that the relatives are going through, and what are some of the environmental things that they're facing that are leading them to violence? So why do you think, either Lanice or Vasant, why do you think that there may be people who would act violently towards a elderly relative that has dementia?
Because they, I guess they getting frustrated by,
Mm-hmm.
the way they, act, sometimes, where I work, it's hard to like, get them to, calm down, or um, just doing simple things. It can, it can be a lot.
It is. It's frustration, right? They have
Yes.
this sense of, you're trying to get them to do something. They're not
Mhm.
understanding. They're not doing it. So
Mhm.
frustration is one of the things that we're dealing with here. Um, can you think of anything else?
Mm.
Think about maybe, and this can also because I think frustration is pretty close to, so once somebody's very frustrated, then they're more likely to maybe act violently or just react, right? What kinds of things are leading to the frustration? So you're trying to take care of somebody who's elderly, they have dementia, they're not following instructions, they're repeating the same things over and over again, they're living in an imaginary world. Okay, so how does that lead to frustration? Or think about it, what could prevent them from getting frustrated?
Maybe if
Well,
they had, sorry.
oh no, it's okay.
Basant, you want to go and then Lanice goes?
Okay, so
Okay.
maybe because expectations
Mm-hmm.
is what leads to their frustration, because when you're helping someone, you always expect some reaction from them, and when they don't give you this reaction, so you're frustrated.
Okay, so there have expectations that are not being met, and
Yeah.
those are usually due to maybe a lack of understanding about what dementia is like, right? So if they come in and they know to expect that there's going to be difficulty, right? Maybe when they used to take care of their mom, you know, said, "Hey, mom, why don't you go get your clothes?" And mom used to do it. But now you say, "Hey, mom, go get your clothes," and mom doesn't do it, right? If they know ahead of time that that's the case, that they're not going to be able to take care of themselves anymore, and you're like, "Hey, guys, every once in a while you're going to ask your mom to do something and she's not going to know how to do it," maybe you become less frustrated, right? Because you have an expectation that she might not be able to do it. Correct?
Yes.
That makes sense. What were you going to say, Lanice?
Oh, nothing.
The other thing I think, what about the fact that sometimes, particularly if you don't have an extended family taking care of someone, let's say that you have one or two people taking care of someone, that could lead to frustration, may be that they can't take a break, can they? So if you have somebody who can't take care of themselves, you can't leave them. You can't leave them alone.
Yes.
So what happens when you can't ever leave somebody alone? You have to be with them 24/7.
Um. Well, I know as a health provider, it leads
Mm-hmm.
to like burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Um.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm, yeah,
And
burnout.
burnout, definitely. So people who are feeling burned out, they're going to get frustrated. And one of the things that happens too, if you're always taking care of someone and you can't sort of get away, is that you become socially isolated, right? Because you're not going out, you're just doing your own thing. And hopefully there's people who have mature enough friends that are like can understand and kind of still visit you. But a lot of the times people are like, oh, I really don't want to deal with that, right? And so they may not come, or I don't want to bother them, I don't want to burden them, and then they don't come, and you're basically socially isolating people. And the reason I'm going through in this level of detail is that notice, even though it's very hard to say, okay, is there anything that I can do? Is there anything that can be placed in place to stop the violence? I mean, obviously there are going to be laws against it, so nobody can, in the US, even if you're somebody's son or somebody's daughter or somebody's spouse, you really can't hit anybody or abuse them. So it could be punishable by prison time. But we don't really want to just rely on the justice system to do this. This is not what we want to happen.
Can I say something?
Uh-huh.
Well, because last week when we were researching, some of the research said that only like 8% of people who have been abused report this, and this is really a big issue that you don't even know that there's some people abused. So the number maybe more than 8%, but there's no one is reporting.
Well, and if it's somebody who has dementia, they won't be able to report it, right? Because they may not even remember it happened. So sometimes you will see them and they're bruised and they're scratches, and you're like, what happened? And they can't tell you. Now, of course, it could be older people also bruise really easy and their skin's real thin and it scratches really easy. So it doesn't mean somebody's abusing them, but they can't remember how they got a bruise. They're usually surprised. They look at themselves and like, I don't know how I did that. So if somebody's hitting them, they won't know, right? But what are some of the things? Oh, okay. So we have these kind of behavioral type stuff. So people maybe don't know how to manage stress, right? Don't know how to, how would I put that? Because frustration's normal, but it has is it coping? It has, what's the term? I'm not very much of a psychologist, can you tell? They have, so if you experience stress, you can have a positive way of acting out on it and a negative way of acting. So they don't have, they don't have, they're negative coping mechanisms, let's call it. Mechanisms. Okay, so those things would be things that would so behavioral and lifestyle issues that might lead to violence. What about some of the environmental things that might lead to and when I say environmental, it doesn't have to be just the physical, and it doesn't have to be like the weather or the physical environment. It can be things like the social environment. What kinds of social environments might lead to maybe an increase of people acting violently towards a relative that has dementia?
Maybe if someone has a parent who have a dementia, their work, for example, just don't appreciate this. They are treating them as a normal person who is not taking care of anyone. So
right.
So
okay,
the pressure from work, and they can't manage between their work and their family life. So this would
absolutely, yes. So I would call that maybe conflicting roles of where you have to be a caregiver and an employee, for example, right? And so if that is something somebody is experiencing, that whatever the work policies are with regards to family leave or flex time might have a role in it. Good. Anything else? Is there anything, say, in the social environment that we can do to help with burnout, social isolation? negative coping mechanisms? Is there anything that in the environment that could change those? Has anybody ever heard of, Lenise, go ahead.
Oh, probably something that can help with burnout, maybe. Probably, some more help, some more support for the caregiver.
Yes.
To give them, some time,
Good. So some of it is actually assistance, right? So getting actual assistance. Also, and I think you alluded to it when you said support, social support. So one thing is to say, hey, maybe a social support group. So go to people. If you go to groups where other people are experiencing similar problems, you won't feel so alone, right? Because you're like, I'm not the only person who has this problem. So you're with other people. You can share ideas of what works, what doesn't work. All of a sudden, you have people who have similar experiences, and you're not alone anymore. And then you can actually give assistance. So let's say that somebody needs to go to the grocery store, or somebody needs to get away for about an hour. If there's somebody who can come in and take care of that person, then they're not going to be feeling as burdened, right? They can get away for a little bit, take a breather, live, kind of live their lives, and then come back refreshed and ready to tackle that again. So notice that it doesn't, you can always, by working backwards on this thing, you can, on this, in this model, you can start thinking of, okay, so what are the things that could be causing these? Now, obviously, there are probably a lot more of these. And so if you were to do the research, you would find different ways of assisting it. Now, some of these solutions are more amenable to policy than others, right? So managing expectations is probably more of an educational, one-on-one, right, teaching. So maybe not as amenable to policy, except if what you're saying is, I am going to have, I think that one of the things that, for example, in the US, older people have Medicare, right? So if that's how they get their primary source of health insurance, maybe that we pay for that, that insurance actually cover classes on how to deal with somebody who has dementia. That would be a policy. Actually offering the classes is what health educators do, right? So the same thing, I think to manage burnout, maybe say having changing those negative coping mechanisms to a positive coping mechanism, so that you're now, let's say when you're faced with something that's very frustrating, instead of losing your temper, every time you face that, maybe you take a deep breath and step outside for a second, and then you come back in. That's a more positive coping mechanism. Again, that's something that would be taught to someone, so that, maybe using cognitive behavioral therapy or something, so that they can work through those emotions and have a more positive response to the emotion. But again, that's more that, and that would fall under more, the social cognitive therapy falls under more like something that a psychologist or a counselor would do. Again, that's not super necessarily policy related. Those are solutions. But when you go to the environmental stuff, that's where you can often really generate policy from that. Because, can you pay for home health? Absolutely. So you could figure out ways that maybe home health becomes more affordable, that it becomes more acceptable, that that people say, yeah, that should be part of everyday life for somebody who has this condition. There are ways to increase social support, right? And there are ways, definitely, I loved Basant's idea of looking at what can employees do? What are some of the things that what can employers do? What are some of the things that make it easier for people who have to take care of somebody who's a little bit older? So that's kind of the process. I'm not saying that I've done it for you. Obviously, there's a lot of research that goes involved in that, but that's some of the ways that you can use this particular framework to sort of think about solutions to the problem. So, and I don't know why, but it seems like I did this before. Maybe not. So overall, let's start. So for this assembling the evidence thing, what can you do? Well, start early. So don't wait till the day before, because you do have to be pretty creative, and you do have to have time to brainstorm together. The other thing is, as you're collecting the evidence, always think about kind of doing not a formal cost benefit analysis, because I'm not teaching that, but kind of start thinking about, is it something that when you say, we're going to do a particular thing, there's always some kind of cost involved to it. It could be money, but it could also be time. It could be social capital. It could be, there's a lot of things. There's always some cost to every action, right? There's always something that somebody has to do to have a particular action. So just be kind of sort of start collecting that information as you're going along, sort of like, okay, I think this is a great, this is how I do it. I think this is come up with a possible solution, things that you think, and then what are some of the pros and cons to that? Because that's going to help you later on when you're doing your policy analysis. Also, ensure that you're always checking the existing literature. It's great to brainstorm, but make sure there's things that have been done in the US. There's things that have been done in other countries, right? So even if it's even the solution happened in another country, is it something that could be done here? You may find that yes, it could be done. Or you may look at, remember when we talked about the political and social environment, and be like, yeah, that worked really well in Finland, but it's not going to work here. Okay. And that's okay too. But at least you have those ideas. The other thing is, and this sort of goes back to what I was just saying about the social and cultural environment. Whenever you think, oh, this is a great solution, I really like this, keep in mind who is going to say, I don't want to do that, right? And why are they going to say that, right? So be aware, because that's going to make you write better policy. So if you are saying, well, this is a solution, be aware who's going to tell you, we're not going to do that. That's not a good idea. We don't want to do that. Because if you can keep them in mind, you may be able to rebut their but, right? You can say, when they say but, you're like, oh, I can answer that, right? Or you can come up with a way of making it more palatable to that group. Or you can add something that makes it a little less painful for that group. So keep that in mind. Think a little bit as maybe a conflict resolution worker, somebody who, if you're thinking as a policy analyst, is try to think about, okay, this is a good solution. Who's going to object to this? Who's going to be, I don't think this is a great idea. And how can you make them feel better about your solution? Because it makes it more likely that a policy will pass. And so because you're going to be doing this, this step is political as well as analytical. You're not just saying, okay, these are the solutions and then be done. You're thinking, these are the solutions. For all these solutions, there's positives and negatives, and there are people who are going to be for and against it. And so if you've kind of created that checklist for yourself, so solution, pros and cons, who's with us, who's against us, you are going to be able to, once you have a long list of figuring out, okay, so what's likely to work, what's likely to fly in our political environment. And so the way of doing this is to, and this is what we call it, gather the evidence, is to do the research. The book always says, start with what you know. You know an awful lot. So for example, Lenise, I don't know what project your group is necessarily working on, but let's say that your group is, you said you work as a healthcare provider?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let's say that if you are working with elderly people, right, as a healthcare provider, you have already some expertise, right, because you've seen it. And you probably are aware of any regulations that exist, anything. So start with what you know, right? That means that your group could go to you and say, okay, Lenise, right off the top of your head, what is it we know? That doesn't mean you're the only one doing it, because like everyone in the field, we don't know everything in our own field. So, but it's a place to start. And then once you start with what you know, see if there are any gaps or what else is out there. So you can do this. I love journal articles. That's a lot of the times where I start, is doing a lit review, going to my databases, finding a good review article it's just how I've always done it. It's what I like to do. There are also internet documents. There are what we call white papers. White papers are usually as a result of analyses, often in policy, that haven't been published formally the in the peer-reviewed literature, so you're not going to find them in journals, but you may find them in think tanks, right? So there are organizations like the Cato Institute and the Brookings Institute, and this is what they do. These policy think tanks, they publish white papers, and they're in their website. So you can look at their white papers, and you can look at some of the things that they are saying are possible solutions. And as long as you reference them, right? You say, oh, I got this from the Brooklyn Institute. Yes, the Brookings Institute. I don't know why I keep saying with an L in there. The Brookings Institute. Then that's okay, right? You're quoting them. It's okay to look at what they're saying. You'll have other ideas. They'll have some ideas. The other place where it's very useful, particularly if you're trying to get a sense of what is the political and social environment, is to look at newspapers, right? Because that kind of tells you a lot of the times is this something that if I were to pitch it to the Mississippi legislature, they would be very happy with? Now, Lanice, you may be more familiar with the Mississippi legislature than Basant, for example. But it is helpful to know, like, are they likely to support this or not, right? It's good to have that information. The other thing that's important to have, and this is more true, not so much in this particular assignment, because you might go and actually pitch the policy to someone. That would be awesome. But let's say that, in real life, you graduate and you are a policy analyst, you're a health educator that's expertise is policy. Well, the other group, what you really would do is engage your stakeholders, right? You wouldn't do this alone in a vacuum. You would talk to people who that's their area of expertise. So you would say, hey, what is it that I need to know in order to write this policy, right? Because there are people who need to be consulted. They're the people who are the experts. And a lot of the times when you consult people and when you ask them questions and they become part of the solution, they're more likely to support you because it's their idea, right? Nobody likes to have people tell them how to do their job when not. So for example, I'm not a healthcare provider. If I go to you, Lanice, and I'm like, I don't like the way you're doing this. I think you should do it this way. You'd probably be like, yeah, I don't think so, right? That's not, this is what I do for a living. That's what you do for a living, and we stay apart. But if I come to you and I say, hey guys, can we all get together and sort of come up with a solution together? You're more likely to go along with it because you have been part of the solution. And then the other thing is, sometimes in a lot of cases, you're going to find that there isn't a lot of maybe research or evidence, in which cases you can do your own research. So if there's no secondary source available, so there's no published literature, there are no big data banks like the ones you saw in epidemiology or epidemiology is probably where you run most into your data sets. If that doesn't exist or you don't see it anywhere, you can do your own. You can do surveys, you could do observational studies, right? You could do interviews. So those are all ways of gathering evidence. So that's pretty much it. It sounds short. I know it will take time. Do you have questions?
No, ma'am.
Nope. And Basant, you're okay? Everybody okay then? So what I'm going to do is I am going to try to remember how to turn this thing off. Okay, let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so the framework, the precede, proceed framework, is this one we should do in this assignment too?
Listen, I find it's primarily used for health educators. The reason I like it is because it does take you through the entire process. So in fact, you start with some kind of problem in society that you see, because we're health educators, it's usually health related. We look at behaviors that affect that. We look at the environment. and we also know that environment affects behavior. So we go back and forth. Then there's this whole set of tools that we call predisposing and reinforcing factors, which basically means that behaviors are based on our beliefs, attitudes, like you said, expectations, intentions. Our behaviors are all based on that. So sometimes in order to look at our behaviors, we have to see why we behave that way. And then we either positively or negatively reinforced by society, life, our environment. And then the enabling factors is, can we, so if we tell somebody get social support so that you don't get as angry with your mom, well, is there access to social support? Do we have enough of a social network that we can actually get social support? So those are the three. I would say that, remember when I told you to kind of look at a policy assessment, sort of an environmental political assessment? That's kind of that phase 5, which are the policies, the regulations, those organizational functions, are they going to be with us or against us in our policy? And then this kind of falls again more along, once you implement a policy, it needs to be evaluated. I can put these slides up, and so you have access to the framework. I wouldn't go into, so if somebody's taking the program planning class, they are expected to know a lot more detail about this framework, and there's an entire book about the framework. I don't expect that in this class, but you can use it as a template for what you probably already know how to do. I mean, I think it's pretty intuitive. But yes, I will put this up if you want it, and there are resources if you Google Precede Proceed. Particularly, there's this group called the Community Toolbox. They have a whole thing on Precede Proceed, because they're just a health education toolbox. Did that help?
Yes, it will help more if you just upload it, so we
I
can
will. I will save it as a PDF and put it up into. This was module 5, right? I can put it in module 5, and I'll put it in the announcements.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
You're good? Okay. Okay, and I am going to also upload the recording. So, everything else okay? And if you have any questions that come up later, just remember, text, email, drop by, whatever you prefer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, take care. Good night, guys.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.